started this research about 5 years ago, and it is for my doctoral treatise, and it is on her solo vocal works, and I've had a wonderful journey collecting photographs and manuscripts and information about the life and solo vocal works of Margaret Vaughn. We'll start with her family background and her childhood. This, first of all, is a photograph that I found to be absolutely wonderful. Her and Langston Hughes with some friends. It looks like it may be at a restaurant or a nightclub. And probably it was when she was living in New York, and this was taken by Kurt Clemens, and I got this at the Schomburg Center. Erase no less a nation as prosperous in proportion to the intelligence of its women. Dr. Monroe Alvis Majors. And if you don't know who Dr. Monroe Alvis Majors is, that was Margaret Vaughn's father. He was born in 1864 in Waco, Texas, and her mother was Estella C. Vaughn, born in 1882 in New York. And she was actually born as Margaret Jeanette Allison Majors, and we'll talk about why her name changed in a minute. From my mother, a church organist, Estella Vaughn, I actually had physical contact with all the living composers of African descent. And then the Vaughn's household, completely unbiased racially, entertained humanitarians of all racial and religious groups, and the family of limited financial affluence gave Margaret, child prodigy, every opportunity for the study of music with the most eminent. And that is definitely the case. Her mother was an organist. She was an accomplished pianist and music educator. And she was born in New York, but her family moved to Chicago in 1900, and they moved to a home at 6652 Wabash Avenue, and we'll see a picture of what that looks like today in just a minute. She was a charter member of the National Association of Negro Musicians, and she was actually a founder of that organization as well. She was on the faculty at Coleridge Taylor Music School, and she spent over 2 decades working as the organist and choral director of the Berean Baptist Church in Chicago, and at that time in the 1920s, that is the only church where African Americans could work as paid musicians. So here Margaret was in this household full of musicians. They were visiting all the time, and sometimes on Sundays her mother would put on these concerts, and of course Margaret was exposed to all this wonderful music and musicians at such a young age. And Richardson once said in an interview with Helen Walker Hill that her mother was also very instrumental in helping many careers, or of the careers of many young artists, including Marian Anderson. So already she had her path set out for her. Her father, as I stated before, was Dr. Monroe Alvis Majors, and I'd like to talk just a little bit about him. That quote that I read at the beginning was from his book that was published in 1892 by Harvard Publishing Company, and it was called Noted Negro Women. And that book, if you've ever looked at it, it is still available online, and it's a wonderful biography of African-American women from the 1800s, and it's just an absolutely wonderful resource if you'd like to look at that. But that's where the quote came from, and he was a doctor. He was not only a physician, he was also a civil rights activist and an author, as I just said. He studied literature for 1 year at Central Tennessee College in Nashville, and then in 1883 he entered Meharry Medical College, and he graduated as the salutatorian of his class in 1866. There were many things that he accomplished before he even met Estella Vaughn. Stella was his second marriage, and he moved to Chicago, or was in Chicago around 1908, and that's when he met Estella. But before he met her, this is what he did. He was the first African American to practice medicine west of the Rocky Mountains, where he lectured on medical topics before the Los Angeles Medical College. He also helped to build and operate a hospital for African Americans at Paul Quinn College in Waco, Texas. And he also was responsible for adding the term paralysis diabetes to medical literature. And if you'd like to Google him online, you can find a lot of information about him under the Lone Star Medical Association, and that was the first medical association of African American doctors in Texas. So this man was quite a brilliant individual and had made many accomplishments before he had met Estella. And so he moves around quite a bit: Texas, Los Angeles, Chicago, and he moved to Chicago again and was working for a newspaper called The Conservator, and for a time he worked with Frederick Douglass as well at the Providence Hospital in Chicago. And just to give you a little bit of information about who he was, during that time, like I said, he was a civil rights activist, and Dionne Richardson stated in one of those interviews that he moved into a place where there was a lot of KKK activity, and so he hired several white women to be his secretaries. So this was the kind of spirit that he had. I mean, he was definitely, you know, ready to take charge and to, you know, remove any kind of racial bias in his life. And that's just a wonderful, wonderful background that Margaret had with her parents. So moving on, in 1908 then, of course, he meets Estella, and in 1909 they marry. Unfortunately, by 1915, well, let's see here, Margaret Vaughn's, of course, born in 1913, but by 1913 they separated and divorced in 1917. And at that time, Estella Bonds changed Margaret's name to Margaret Allison Bonds, and I imagine she did that just to keep things, you know, just to keep some continuity there, you know, because that was her name, and of course that was Estella's mother's name, so her grandmother actually had the same name. And Dionne Richardson said it was a very bitter divorce, but this is what I found to be really interesting. This summer, when I was listening to this interview, she said that Estella Bonds and Dr. Majors actually reconciled in 1957 for about 3 months. So Margaret was 40 years old, and Dionne Richardson said for a hot minute they got back together. And I just found that really wonderful, very fascinating, and you know, sometimes that happens. And of course, they had this wonderful daughter that did so many wonderful things. And Estella moved to Los Angeles for a few months, and then of course, you know, it was over, and she moved back to Chicago. And eventually Estella lived with Margaret in New York, and that's where that's actually where she was when she passed. All right, so going on to the childhood years, the instructors that Margaret Bonds had, her first piano instructor was her mother, Estella. And then Martha B. Anderson was her second piano instructor. And Martha B. Anderson was also a founder of the NAMM and was on the board of directors in 1924. And at 5 years old, not only did Margaret start studying with Martha B. Anderson, she also composed her very first piano piece. And in Mildred Denby Green's book, Black Women Composers, A Genesis, she states that, or she actually did an interview with a family friend, Ruby Clark, and she stated that the piece was not written down, but she played it proudly for us. So that's pretty impressive, you know, I mean, that she's 5 years old and here she is already composing music. And the name of that piece was Market Street Blues. So she knew who she was and she knew what she wanted to do musically. The very first, you know, title of her first composition incorporated these African-American forms, the blues, right? So absolutely wonderful. Then she began studying with Tom Theodore Taylor at the Coleridge Taylor School, where her mother taught. And of course, Abby Mitchell and Will Marion Cook were also very influential in her life. This is Will Marion Cook. Will Marion Cook, of course, was the first composer and a producer of a Broadway musical with an all African-American cast, and that was in Dahomey in 1903. And the lyricist for that particular musical was Paul Laurence Dunbar. And Abby Mitchell, of course, was his wife, and I don't have a picture of her, unfortunately, but Abby Mitchell was very influential, as the both of them were, on Margaret and her music. And Margaret stated about Will Marion Cook, she says, when composer Will Marion Cook had an opportunity to present a Negro choir on NBC, I was sent to extract all of his choral parts, which incidentally he changed daily. Even now, when I write something for a choir and it's jazz, bluesy, and spiritual, and Tchaikovsky all rolled up into one, I laugh at myself. That's Will Marion Cook. So this is how much his music influenced her. I mean, she was probably working with him as early as age, what, maybe 10 or something? Yeah. So here she was learning how to transcribe these parts, and she did this for Florence Price as well, as we'll learn in a minute. And Abby Mitchell was a very well-known opera singer, art song recitalist, and Broadway singer, and she was the first to introduce her to art songs. So Margaret Vaughn learned a lot about vocal music through Abby Mitchell, and in fact learned that the words and the music had to be married to one another, and that's something that Margaret actually said at one point. course, William Levy Dawson. At that time, he was, I believe, he was doing several things in the Chicago area. He had gotten his master's degree, and he was also working as a trombonist in one of the orchestras in Chicago, and working at the Berean Baptist Church, or working with the musicians at the Berean Baptist Church, and so he would visit their home as well, and became one of her composition teachers. And of course, we know that he is the director and founder of the Tuskegee choir, the Tuskegee Institute choir, the famed choir. And then Florence Price, 1888 to 1953, was her third piano teacher and composition instructor as well. And of course, she helped to transcribe many of her symphonies, and by doing so, learned so much about music and composition in general. Now here is an actual photograph from last summer of the street where she lived on. And this is the Betsy Ross Elementary School. And these two photographs are actually where the house would have sat. It is no longer there. There's a whole kind of empty plot of land here, and then there's a residential area up on the right. But this house right here probably looks similar to what the house looked like then, because that was a pretty old building. And
we actually have a photograph we can show
oh,
the next.
You do?
That's what I have in my
okay,
PowerPoint.
Wonderful.
So I'll show that the next.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
And then right here, this is I believe it's a taxi cab garage or something like that, but there's some houses off to the right. So that's the area where she lived, and it's very close to the highway, you know, just a wonderful neighborhood. And next we have, in 1929, the National Association of Negro Musicians awarded Margaret Vaughn a scholarship to attend Northwestern University. And she was a member of that association as well. And so she entered Northwestern University in 1929, and it was at a time of great segregation. Unfortunately, there were no dormitories available for African American students, and in fact, I looked at some of the catalogs and the old you know, information of the tuition and the dormitories at that time, and it was very interesting to see all of that. The tuition was somewhere around $200 a semester, I believe. And she rode the train every day to Northwestern, and I tell you, that drive is quite a drive from Chicago. And I actually, you know, drove this route going from Wabash to Evanston. So it's quite a long trip. So here she was making this trip twice a day, and she you know, may have worked on her music, who knows? But the train ride was probably about an hour long. Her music instructors at Northwestern were as follows. Piano instructor Emily Butcher-Bogue. Now, Emily Butcher-Bogue, I have to say, she kept immaculate files, and I think I spoke with Ashley about this too. She looked at these files. They were absolutely wonderful. I found so many archival materials, and you'll see in those books over there from the Northwestern University archives. She kept all of Margaret's programs, the programs where she played the John Alden Carpenter's concerto, which you'll hear about in a minute. And just several other things. There were some letters written by Margaret there in the late 60s and early 70s, so they were lifelong friends. And her composition instructors, Arnie Oldberg and Carl Beecher, who at the time was the Dean of the School of Music. Here is a picture of Emily Butcher-Bogue and Arnie Oldberg, and here is Carl Beecher. And here is a quote from Carl Beecher that was on her advertising sheet for 3536. I have no hesitation in saying, that she is the most talented African American who has been in the school during 40 years. Her attainments are nothing short of unusual, and she has a decided gift as a composer. So already she had quite a bit of favor with her composition and piano instructors. Outstanding accomplishments while at Northwestern University, and here she begins to shine, you know, as obviously as a prodigy. In 1932, this is before she even finished her bachelor's, she won the first prize in the song category for her composition Sea Ghost or Sea Wolf. I read somewhere that it was also called Sea Wolf, and this was for at the Wanamaker competition. And at that competition, Florence Price was competing as well, and she won several awards. And I believe that she won about $250 for that first prize award, and that's quite a bit. That's a lot of money. In fact, that would have covered her entire tuition for one semester. So this was a great honor, a great deal of money. And through that, her and Florence were both asked to participate in the exposition at the Chicago World's Fair the next year. That's how they got the invitation, and that's when she became the first African American to perform as a featured soloist concert pianist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. On June 15, 1933, Margaret Vaughn performed John Alden Carpenter's Concertino with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Frederick Stock for the Century of Progress exposition at the Chicago World's Fair. Now here is an actual program from that time, and that was found in the Emily Butcher Bogue files at the Northwestern University Archives. Here's a picture of Roland Hayes here, George Gershwin, who was actually on the same concert program as Margaret. That night he was playing Rhapsody in Blue. So can you imagine, here she was, maybe 21, yeah, playing on the same concert program as George Gershwin. So she was doing great things. Here's Ruth Page, and Ruth Page and Catherine Dunham danced La Diablesse by William Grant Still. Now the interesting thing about that is that Margaret Vaughn and Florence Price served as the rehearsal pianist for that particular production in Chicago. So while she was getting ready to play with the Chicago Symphony, she was also, playing as a rehearsal pianist for William Grant Still, Still's ballet, right, and working with Ruth Page and Catherine Dunham, who, were famed ballet dancers and modern dancers. And here we have a newspaper review. She has a brilliant, well-developed technique with a tone tending toward modern brittleness rather than old-fashioned suavity. She played with much composure and good sense of the lines of construction of the work. Chicago Tribune, June 16, 1933. And I don't know if there are any existing recordings. Does anyone know about that, of that particular? Okay, I didn't think so. It would be so wonderful if we could find one, right? Then in 1933, she won the Rosenwald Scholarship Award, and this was she received the Bachelor of Music from Northwestern, and she became Ned Rorem's first piano and composition instructor. Okay, so Ned Rorem, I believe, was born in 1923. He is still living and one of the most prolific American art song composers that we have. And here is the program from the Commencement Recital from 1934, May 23rd, 1934. This would have been when she got her master's degree. And she played the sonata in D major by Mozart with Gene Williams. So it was a duo, a piano duo, if you can see that from here. Okay, hold on a second. We'll just look at that for a minute. So while she was at Northwestern, she won this particular scholarship, and she met Rufus Rorem, who was the dean of the University of Chicago, I believe, but his son was Ned Rorem, and so when he heard her play at that competition, he asked her to be asked her if she would be willing to teach his son, and she agreed, and when she did so, and here's actually a quote from Ned Rorem concerning their lessons. And today I actually wore open-toed heels. Yeah. And the reason why I did that is, and I'm not going to read that quote today, but I'll just paraphrase. In one of Ned Rorem's diaries, he talks about the first time he met Margaret Vaughn and how she was wearing open-toed heels. And he had never seen such a thing in his life. He was like, what kind of shoes are those? So he learned that she was a very stylish young woman. And so I am wearing these in memory of Margaret Vaughn today. All right, so here we are, and talking about, let me back up a minute, I'm sorry. I wanted to make mention of this, concerning the John Alden Carpenter's Concertino. This is the concertino that she played with the Chicago Symphony. Her teacher, I found this letter in the files, and her teacher actually was working on the same piece about 2 or 3 years prior to Margaret playing it, okay? And this is what Emily Butcher Bogue says of the piece. I have been all over the school practicing all day long. I have to finish memorizing the concerto by Carpenter for next Wednesday. It's a stunning modern concerto, and if Mr. DeSalle thinks the Evanston Symphony will be capable of playing, I'll probably play it on one of their concerts next year. It is written in regular concerto form, 3 movements, etc., but with difficult jazz rhythms. It's technically hard to play. I found a person out here who can play the orchestral accompaniment, I haven't asked Mr. Oldberg, I haven't found a person out here who can play the orchestral accompaniment. I haven't asked Mr. Oldberg, but all the rest have tried it, and it sounded terrible. So that just tells you the level of difficulty of this piano music. Her professor was performing this music about 3 years before she did it, and so there she was in her early 20s performing it with the Chicago Symphony. Phenomenal. And I was amazed to find this. I was just going through the letters and just somehow saw the name John Alvin Carpenter, and there it was, a quote about this particular piece. Then she begins teaching Ned Rorem, and here he gives an account of one of their lessons, and this is how important she was and how influential she was as a music educator, even at 20. It was then that Margaret, from my dictation at the piano, notated the Glass Cloud, which was also by John Alvin Carpenter, and it was influenced by her other star pupil, Gerald Cook, a year or two older than I, and taught me from that to notate. I have a dozen notebooks from that period brimming with impressionist studies. So he credits Vaughn's for having taught him how to notate. And what a wonderful accomplishment already. You know, she was just doing brilliant things. So when she graduated from Northwestern University, she continued in her endeavors. And one of the first things she did was write the music for a theater production called Romeo and Juliet, and this is the program from that particular production. It was had a successful run, and obviously had several performances. And the song that she wrote, or there was one song in that particular production, it was called Sing Weary. It was an acapella song. This right here is a picture of her, and this is also from the Northwestern University archives. It was an advertising, I guess it was a booking advertisement for 1935 and 1936. And here's a quote, and I don't know if I can see it from there, but there are several quotes in there from different artists. And this is from the man that played the Lord in Green Pastures. And he was just talking about how wonderful her piano playing was and how he would like her to come and work with his students.
William Warfield?
Yeah, I believe so.
Richard Harrison? Richard B. Harrison?
If I can go back, let me see. Do I arrow back? Yes,
Yeah.
okay. It is, yes, Richard Harrison, that's right. Yeah, Richard B. Harrison. Yes. And he says, I wish to thank you for a delightful performance. And he just talks about how wonderful her piano playing is and how wonderful of a musician she is. Okay, and then in 1936, she meets Langston Hughes. Now, she of course had been influenced by Langston prior to meeting him in 36. And how was she influenced by him? Does anyone know? Does anyone know the story?
Yeah, I know Langston lived in Chicago for
Yes, he did.
a certain amount of time.
Yes, that is true. And she would have known some of his friends and certainly would have heard about him, but she was actually connected to him via his literature before they ever met in person. And this is what she says while she is at Northwestern. I was in this prejudiced university, this terribly prejudiced place. I was looking in the basement of the Evanston Public Library where they had the poetry. I came in contact with this wonderful poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and I'm sure it helped my feelings of security, because in that poem, he, Langston Hughes, tells how great the black man is. And if I had any misgivings, which I would have, to have here, you are in a setup where the restaurants won't serve you, and you're going to college, you're sacrificing, trying to get through school, and I knew that poem helped save me. Isn't that magnificent? This is the way his literature affected her years before she met him, and this was probably in 1934 or so. And I found actually through the programs at Northwestern Archives a program where she had written a setting of Langston Hughes' poem d'Automne in 1934. And according to the Helen Walker Hill research, those songs were written in 1936. But who knows, there might have been a date somewhere that said 1936, but it actually was 1934. However, this particular song, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and I'm sure many of you have heard this piece, is absolutely wonderful, was written in 1936, and it was written after she met Langston Hughes. They had a lifelong friendship. They collaborated for many years musically, artistically, and of course there are probably, well, there's a whole box of letters between the two of them at the Center for Black Music Research in Chicago at Columbia Teachers College. And this is a photograph of him. Okay, And so then, she of course was highly influenced by him, and in her musical endeavors, she continues to write jazz songs, art songs. In fact, before she even moved to New York, artists such as Cab Calloway and Jimmy Lunsford were playing and recording her pieces. But in 1939, she moves to New York, and before that, she also set up a school, an arts academy called the Allied Arts Academy, and she was the director and founder of that school, which was quite something. Unfortunately, the school closed because of the Great Depression, and she decided to move to New York, and she said she moved there with $37 in her pocket to begin a career as a composer. Wonderful. And how many of us can relate to that? You know, when we're trying to press forward, to realize our dreams, we do that at whatever cost, right? And she had $37. And boy, did she make that $37 stretch, because by 1939, she was working as the rehearsal pianist with Leonard Harper at the Apollo Theater. This was a position that was once held by Duke Ellington. She also started working for Clarence Williams Publishing Company, which gave her access to many of the artists in the Tin Pan Alley. So because of that, she was able to work with artists such as Andy Razov, and okay, there we go. And she wrote Peachtree Street, Another Song Was Georgia, and that was recorded by Bob Zerke in 1939. It was also used for the film Gone with the Wind. And I'm not sure if it was for the release of the film or if it was actually in the film. I don't know if anyone knows that. I've watched the film, but okay, that's fine. We'll continue to research that and see where it was, but it was a part of that film. And then in 1941, with the Glenn Miller Orchestra, recorded Spring Will Be So Sad. 1941, she also began to work with Langston Hughes and Arne Bonton on a musical review project for the Diamond Jubilee, which was to happen in Chicago, and did happen in Chicago. But they started having some really serious financial problems, and only one or two of the songs were actually performed for that particular production, but there were 7 altogether, and they're wonderful musical theater pieces. And those are housed at the Center for Black Music Research in Chicago, and probably they're located in other places as well, but I know that they're there as part of the Helen Walker Hill collection. Here is a quote from Langston Hughes, and this is found in, let's see here, The Collected Works of Langston Hughes, Volume 6, Gospel Plays, Operas, and Later Dramatic Works, which is edited by Leslie Catherine Sanders. It was published in 2004. And this is what he says about this work. He says, I have only 3 songs left in the show, 2 of Randolph's and Your Pretty Flower. The expo is confidentially, in a very bad way financially, so I guess we're lucky to get what little we did out of the show. Doubt if we'll get another penny, except what we might be able to do with the book and music on our own. So that is what happened with the show, but of course, she did get a couple of her songs performed at one of the programs for the Diamond Jubilee. So, moving on, she begins to study at the Juilliard School with Dion Hertz and Roy Harris, and she had a scholarship of some sort to study with them. And then later on in 1958, she studies with Robert Starrer. And in 1940, Langston Hughes, her good friend, introduces her to Florence Richardson, who is a colleague from Lincoln University. And in 1941, they marry, and they have their daughter, Dionne Richardson, who was born October 23rd, 1946. And here is a quote from Langston from the Chicago Defender. I might end up way down past where Harlem runs into Central Park at Margaret Vaughn's place, where some mighty swell piano is played, and whose husband, Larry Richardson, is a fellow Lincolnite too. So that gives you an idea about how their relationship and how close they were. I know that Dionne Richardson referred to him as Uncle Langston, so they were very close. And here is another photograph of the modern day 240 East 106th Street. Great. Okay, so I went there and looked for the building, and this is what I found: an empty plot of land where these trees are. I don't know what happened to the apartment. They lived there for about 17 years and then moved somewhere else in Harlem. But this is the building off to the side. So I'm assuming, since both of those buildings look exactly the same, the building she lived in looked the same. Yeah. Very nice community. It's a residential community mostly, and off to the side is the river. And that's where they lived, and this is probably the way Langston saw her at the piano playing in their apartment. It's wonderful. Okay, and so, continuing on, noteworthy accomplishments. These are, I'll just go through here and read these. In 1942, her and Hortense Love, who was a colleague from Northwestern, premiered 5 Creek Friedman spirituals at Hortense Love's Town Hall debut. In 1945, she toured with Gerald Cook, and they toured many southern states. They toured in the northern states as well. I know that they did a tour of HBCUs in the southern states and around that time. And Gerald Cook was one of her piano students from the Allied Arts Academy in Chicago. So now he was in New York working with her, and also played with Nina Simone and several other really famous jazz artists. And then in 1950, she became the first African American not to tour, sorry, but to be a featured soloist as a concert pianist with the Scranton Philharmonic Orchestra, and once again played the John Alden Carpenter Concertino. In 1952, she had her Town Hall debut on February 7th, and in 1954, The Ballad of the Brown King premiered December 12th. Yes. So, and would you like to say anything, Asha, just a bit about that, the premiere? No? Okay. All right, we'll move on. We'll hear that. We'll hear
Yeah.
that. Yes, right. We'll hear
Tomorrow
that
we
tomorrow.
can
Yes,
assess,
it's a prelude.
There's something that you have here that says that she wrote Ballad of the Brown King in 1960, so was it in 54 or was it in 60?
It may have been published. Yeah, it was probably published in 61. Is that right?
Yeah, in 1854 there was kind of the first version of these. She revised it and orchestrated it for 1960, and then it was published
In 1961 by Sam Fox. Okay, good.
And so
Yes.
was the dedication to King after it was published, or was it when it was written in 54?
Well, the dedication to King, I think, was in 1960, right? So,
just
so
before the
just before the
by
publication.
the
Yes.
So
Yeah.
after its conception.
Yes.
Mhm.
And the first performance was a collegiate performance,
Yeah.
wasn't it? And it was televised, I believe.
The 54 or the 60?
The 54, is that right? Or?
I'm not sure. 1960 was definitely
Okay,
televised.
okay, all right, good. Well, we'll stay tuned for that. And then going on, in 1957, she organized the Harlem Jazz Mobile and that's something that Frank Foster was also a part of. 1957, Harlem Cultural Council. And she began to work with the Harlem Cultural Council, and this was a group of musicians and literary artists that worked to bring music and art education into the communities in Harlem. And by 1962, she was appointed chairman of the music committee by the Manhattan Borough President Edward Dudley to aid in establishing a cultural community center in Harlem. And this is a newspaper clipping from the New York chief about that particular position. And that was also from the Northwestern University archives. Additional awards. 1964, she received the Woman of the Century Award. She received the Woman of the Century Award. And then in 1964, she also received her first 3 ASCAP awards. In 1967, she received another award. This was the Alumni Merit Award from Northwestern University. And Mayor Richard Daley also declared January 31st as Margaret Vaughn's Day in Chicago. So this was quite an amazing honor. And here she is receiving this Merit Award from Northwestern. And this is a newspaper clipping from the Pittsburgh Courier, and that was also retrieved from the Northwestern University archives, this digital photograph was. So, in 1967, she was invited to attend a National Association of Negro Musicians conference in San Francisco, and at that time she began to talk with her friends, Janice Lovos and Edmund Penny, and a lot of them influenced her to move to Los Angeles, which she did. And at that time, she became the music director at the Inner City Repertory Theater in Los Angeles, and where they put on many shows, such as Street Scene by Kurt Weill, and of course the lyricist was Langston Hughes. And then in 1971, she was honored again by the NA&M Golden Gate branch, and in the same year, San Francisco Little Symphony performed her symphonic work, Scripture Reading. And in 1971, Langston Price and the Russ Choir College recorded I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free on RCA Victor Records. And there were 3 recordings, or 3 arrangements that Vaughn's composed on that record. And if you attend the session today at 5:15, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, and we'll listen to those records actually. On April 26, 1972, she dies at age 59. And her student, Gary Alsby, who was her student at the Inner City Repertory Theater, was the student to find her. She was actually in her house for a couple of days before they discovered that she had passed. And what's interesting about this is that the Los Angeles Philharmonic performed her oratorio, the Credo, which is which includes the words of W.E.B. Du Bois. This was a particular composition that she had been working on for, I believe, around 5 years at that point. And it is orchestrated. It's a big oratorio work with several solo vocal pieces and choral pieces in it. And before she passed, now this is what I learned this summer in an interview done by Helen Walker Hill as well, with Albert McNeil. And Albert McNeil was, of course, the director of the Albert McNeil Singers, and she and Albert were very good friends. And he talked extensively about their friendship and just who she was as a person and just some fun times they had. But he also talked about the organization of trying to get this particular piece performed by the Los Angeles Philharmonic. This was in progress before she died. And Zubin Mehta had originally said that they didn't think they'd be able to do the production at that time. I don't know what the reason was, but he calls Albert McNeil 1 week before Margaret Vaughn dies and says, we're going to do the Vaughn's piece. And Margaret she did not know this. I don't think that she ever learned about that, and I don't know if it was just a couple days before, or if it was a week, and Albert McNeil had not had a chance to tell her that yet. I would imagine that he would have told her right away, so maybe it was just a few days before she passed. But Zubin Mehta had agreed to perform her Credo before she even passed away, but she did not know that. So therefore they went ahead and did a memorial concert in her name and performed her piece, the Credo. Are there any questions about this, about her background, any other thing that you'd like to talk about? Yes, Dale.
I'd love to know more about how she and Langston Price met and how they developed their friendship. Yes,
well, that's a good question. I know that Langston commissioned her frequently to write these spirituals. A lot of the spirituals that she arranged were commissioned for Langston Price, and they were never recorded, but Langston performed most of them with David Garvey at the piano. I don't know how they began their friendship. That is something that I would love to learn. I have not found that information yet, but I know that they had a working relationship for many, many years, and Langston loved her arrangements of spirituals, and so that is how they knew one another. She was originally commissioned to arrange 4 spirituals for that particular recording, but only 3 of them remained on the record. And it was for acapella chorus and choir, so there's no piano accompaniment. And you'll hear later this afternoon about how she took some of the already composed solo vocal piano arrangements and set the piano arrangements to an orchestrated version or use the piano part to arrange the solo choir parts for those particular recordings. Any other questions? Yeah.
In your research, have you been able to find much or any information about Margaret Vaughn's high school musical education?
About her high school?
From the
No,
piano teacher?
I don't know much about it, to be honest with you, other than I have run across the name, and I didn't include that in the discussion today. But other than that, no, I don't know that much about it. Yeah, I just know that it was in that neighborhood in Chicago. Does anyone, I didn't find very much about it other than the high school's name, and it's not coming to me right now.
For some reason, the name Parker High School.
Yes, that's right. That's what it is. Yeah, Parker High School. Absolutely. Yeah.
I
do know that she was a member of the junior division of the National Association of Negro Musicians, at that school. That I do know. So when she was there, she was avidly involved in music and different organizations.
You talked a lot about her work with piano teachers. Did she ever study singing?
No, not to my knowledge.
She has a particular affinity for the voice.
Yes.
And was it just by proxy that she was surrounded by a number of good singers? Or?
Yes, absolutely. I don't believe she ever took voice lessons, not to my knowledge, but like I said, she did study with Abby Mitchell, who was an opera singer and a well-known concert recitalist. And there are accounts of where...
What did she study with her?
She studied composition, and she studied just music in general, because she would come to Abby Mitchell would come to the house, and so from what I read and what my understanding was that Margaret would work with her and look at these songs. So Abby Mitchell showed her Schubert songs, the H.T. Burley song cycle, Ethiopia's Salutes to yes, that's how she found out about that.
Saracen songs or?
Yes, the Saracen songs, maybe even Debussy, several of these wonderful art pieces that were unfamiliar to her before that time. And that's how she learned about this music, was through Abby Mitchell. Lillian Avanti, however, came to their house, and I think that I found this in the Margaret Denby Green dissertation or book, one of the two. I read both of them. But Lillian Avanti, when Margaret was still a child, probably like maybe 8, came to their house and actually did a recital in their living room. And Lillian Avanti was an internationally known opera star. So these are the kinds of singers that were coming through in and out of her house all the time. So I think that probably had a lot to do with it. She knew some of these wonderful singers. Marian Anderson, Estelle Vance was instrumental in helping Marian Anderson's career. So she knew Marian Anderson too, because the first setting, her setting of the Negro Speaks of Rivers was written for Marian Anderson. But Marian Anderson thought it had too many jazzy augmented chords, so she decided to sing Howard Swanson's version. Yeah. Yes. Which we wouldn't think today, but
Which has its own jazziness.
Yeah.
Too.
It does. You're right. Yeah, right. This one.
First of all, it was very fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
Love to get your assessment.
Good.
I'm interested in 2 things. One is probably a lengthy answer. First, who gave her the Woman of the Century Award?
Yes.
Oh yes.
Because she got one from the National Competition of Women, but I don't know if that was.
I believe that's who it was. Yeah. And I'm looking here in my actual dissertation. Well, I can look into that and get back with you, but I believe that you're right about that. I believe that's who it was. Yeah, I believe that was the organization.
And the other question is about her resources. How did she continue to sustain herself as a composer and recitalist, etc., and have enough money also to found an academy for Black youth?
Right. Well, that's a very